Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving straight into, well, a pretty major international disagreement
Mm-hmm.
between two key allies, right? The U.S. and Germany. And suddenly, things have gotten pretty heated.
Yeah, it really flared up.
The core of the issue: Germany's domestic intelligence agency has classified the Alternative for Germany Party, that's the AfD, as a suspected extremist organization.
And what's fascinating here, I think, is that this isn't just, a standard political squabble.
Yeah.
This has some really significant implications for how we understand democracy, for one, but also the weight of historical lessons and, frankly, the future of the whole U.S.-Germany relationship.
Definitely.
It really highlights a fundamental difference, maybe, in how the U.S. and Germany see the state's role in, protecting democracy itself.
How so?
Well, the U.S. tends to lean more towards, let's say, a laissez-faire approach in the marketplace of ideas, even for pretty controversial views.
Right, free speech absolutism, almost.
Kind of. Whereas Germany, scarred by its past, takes a much more interventionist stance to actively safeguard its constitutional principles from what it sees as threats.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, you, our listener, shared a whole stack of articles and briefing documents detailing this clash, plus some crucial background on what exactly we mean by extremism.
It was a whole topic in itself.
Oh, absolutely. So our mission today is to really cut through the noise and understand why this classification happened, why it's causing such a rift, especially with the U.S., and, what the bigger picture really looks like here.
Okay. So let's start with the core action then.
Yeah.
The AfD classification itself. The German Domestic Intelligence Agency, the BFV, they've officially designated the AfD as a suspected extremist organization.
And crucially, this wasn't just a snap decision, was it? It followed quite a significant process.
Oh, definitely not snap. This designation comes after a 3-year investigation.
Yeah.
And it culminated in this really substantial 1,000-page report.
Wow, 1,000 pages.
Yeah. And the BFV specifically cited violations of some really fundamental constitutional principles as the basis for this whole thing.
Like what specifically?
We're talking about human dignity, the principle of democracy itself, and the rule of law. The real bedrock stuff.
That's pretty serious. And, we've seen some state-level AfD branches get this kind of label before, right?
Yes, that's
But this is the first time for the National Party organization in modern German history. That feels like a really big deal.
It absolutely is a major step, and the immediate consequence of this classification. It's basically an expansion of surveillance powers for the German authorities. Meaning they can now more easily intercept calls, maybe deploy undercover agents, things like that, to monitor the party's activities.
Okay, so that's the German side. Now, the U.S. reaction, it has been anything but quiet. We've seen some really strong condemnation coming from prominent figures.
Yeah, strong's putting it mildly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sheer intensity of the U.S. reaction is, well, it's quite noteworthy.
So who said what?
Well, Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He didn't mince words at all. He called the move tyranny in disguise. Straight up.
Tyranny in disguise. Wow.
Yep. And he specifically argued that the AfD's opposition to what he called deadly open border immigration policies. He argued that's just not extremist. It's legitimate political opposition in his view.
He also made a point about their electoral success, didn't he?
He did. He brought up the fact that the AfD came in second place in the last election, really highlighting their significant electoral support.
Yeah.
Which raises that question,
How does a government respond to a popular but deeply controversial political force?
Exactly. It's a tricky balance, isn't it, between protecting democratic principles on one hand and respecting the will of a significant chunk of the electorate on the other.
And it wasn't just Rubio.
No, Vice President J.D. Vance also weighed in. And he drew a rather, dramatic parallel.
Which one?
He compared the whole situation to rebuilding the Berlin Wall.
Seriously? The Berlin Wall?
That's what he said. And he's previously voiced concerns about excluding populist parties, arguing that doing so is like a surefire way to actually destroy democracy, not save it.
So, okay, on one side, you've got these top U.S. officials sounding the alarm about democratic principles being violated by the German government's actions. What's the German government's take on all this incoming criticism?
Well, the German government has been quite firm, really steadfast in its defense. The German Foreign Ministry put out a statement directly responding to the U.S. criticism.
What did it say?
Pretty simply, this is democracy. They emphasized that this decision wasn't political interference, but the result of a full independent investigation aimed squarely at protecting the Constitution and the rule of law.
And they made that really crucial point about learning from history, too.
Exactly. That came up explicitly.
Hmm.
They stated the need to stop right-wing extremism, drawing a very direct line to Germany's past.
Yeah.
The never again principle is deeply embedded there.
Understand.
And they also underscored that the final say in all this will rest with independent courts. They really highlighted the legal and judicial process involved, not just an administrative decision.
Right. It's not just the agency's call in the end.
Correct. There's a process.
Now, let's just pause and remember, despite all this controversy, the AfD is a significant political force in Germany. We can't forget that.
No, absolutely.
In the recent federal elections, the AfD pulled in, 20.8% of the vote?
That's right. Secured 152 seats, which actually makes them the largest opposition party in the German parliament, the Bundestag.
Yet, despite that electoral success, they're facing pretty significant political isolation domestically. It's a strange position.
It really is. Mainstream German parties have consistently and very formally shunned the AfD, just ruled out any possibility of including them in governing coalitions. It's called the Brandmauer, or firewall.
Right, the firewall. And this extremist designation, presumably, is expected to just further solidify that isolation.
That seems to be the expectation, yes. It could potentially prevent them from holding key parliamentary roles, things like committee chairmanships, or even the vice presidency of Parliament itself.
Mm-hmm.
Posts usually distributed based on party strength.
So with this domestic isolation combined with the really strong U.S. reaction we've been talking about, it really does seem like this whole episode is highlighting a deeper rift between the two countries.
I think so. A transatlantic divide, perhaps, that this clash really brings into sharp focus. We seem to be seeing an increasingly deep ideological split between Washington and Berlin, specifically when it comes to understanding and responding to populism and the far right.
It feels pretty unprecedented, doesn't it? Seeing top U.S. officials so publicly, so strongly criticizing a German domestic intelligence decision.
It truly is unusual, highly unusual, and, it goes beyond just rhetoric sometimes.
What do you mean?
Well, there's been actual, let's say, perceived U.S. support for the AfD. Comments from figures like Elon Musk, for instance. And Vice President Vance actually met with the AfD party leader. And this has been seen by many in Germany as, direct intervention in their domestic affairs.
And that kind of intervention, especially in such a deeply sensitive issue for Germany, it inevitably risks putting a real strain on the already, let's be honest, complex transatlantic relationship.
Absolutely. These relations have definitely seen their share of tension lately over various policy issues, differing views on democratic values. This just adds another layer of complexity.
And potentially damages trust.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Some in Germany are now openly questioning their level of trust in the United States, and that could have significant knock-on effects for future German security policy, maybe even their role within NATO down the line.
Yeah, I remember seeing Friedrich Merz before the election talking about Europe needing to represent its own interests.
That's right.
Even if that means, when necessary, taking a stance opposite to the U.S., that really speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It really does. Which kind of brings us back to that definitional problem. How differently these concepts are understood on either side of the Atlantic. Maybe we should delve into how extremism and hate are actually defined.
Good idea, because the sources you shared provided a really broad range of perspectives on this. It's clearly not simple.
Not at all. And the lack of a single unified definition isn't just some academic debate. It directly impacts how governments and international actors perceive and respond to political movements. We're seeing that play out right here in this U.S.-German disagreement.
So looking at the sources, it's clear there's no single universally agreed upon definition. It's quite messy.
Exactly. Take the ADL, for instance, the Anti-Defamation League. They focus on combating anti-Semitism and hate. They define a hate group as an organization primarily based on shared antipathy towards specific groups based on race, religion, that sort of thing.
Okay, and extremism.
Their definition of extremism is broader. It refers to belief systems outside the mainstream that often seek radical change. But importantly, the ADL notes that not all extremist movements are inherently bad. There can be positive extremism, technically.
Interesting distinction. Then you have organizations like the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, right? Known for tracking hate groups in the U.S.
Yes, and the ALA, the American Library Association, too. Both of them tend to define hate groups in terms of attacking or maligning entire classes of people based on immutable characteristics and advocating hatred or violence.
So malice and advocacy of harm seem key there.
Right. And then the FBI's definitions add another layer. They define a hate crime as a traditional offense, like assault or vandalism, but motivated by bias.
And they make a point of saying hate itself isn't a crime.
Crucially, yes. Hate speech or thought alone isn't a crime under U.S. law. They also have definitions for violent extremism, that's supporting violent acts for specific goals, and domestic terrorism, which involves violent acts to further domestic ideological aims. Big difference there.
Okay. Then the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, they talk about radicalizing to violence. What's that?
That's described as the process someone goes through to come to believe that unlawful violence is actually necessary to achieve their goals.
And there was a coalition of groups defining hateful activities.
Yeah, that definition focused on things like inciting violence or intimidation based on protected characteristics like race, religion, sexual orientation, etc.
And it keeps going. ADL again, this time with the Koch Institute?
Right, that definition defined extremism perhaps more narrowly as political thought or action that intentionally uses intimidation or violence for political ends. Focus on the means there.
And finally, Bard College, something about hate studies.
Yes, they frame hate studies more broadly as the academic inquiry into how societies define and dehumanize another, looking at the whole phenomenon.
Wow, okay. Seeing all those different definitions laid out like that, it really highlights just how complex and, frankly, contested these terms are.
Absolutely. It's not nearly as straightforward as it might seem on the surface.
And it makes you realize why different countries, different groups might reach very different conclusions about the same political party or movement.
Precisely. And we absolutely cannot discuss Germany's approach to this without constantly remembering its very specific, very heavy historical context.
No, absolutely. The shadow of the past looms incredibly large there.
It does. And the BFV itself, the intelligence agency, explicitly referenced learning from history as a key driver for this classification. Germany's experience with the rise of Nazism, with right-wing extremism, makes this issue uniquely sensitive and informs their very robust stance. It's baked into their post-war constitution.
Right. The concept of militant democracy, a democracy prepared to defend itself.
Exactly that concept.
Okay, so finally, let's just quickly touch on the recent German elections again and the immediate aftermath. The AfD, as we said, came in second place back in February 2025.
Right, and that election itself only happened because the previous coalition government collapsed, leading to an early vote.
And there was that interesting side note about the left party, Die Linke.
Yes, they experienced a bit of a surprise surge in support. And some analysts speculated that this might have been fueled, at least in part, by a rising tide of anti-American sentiment.
And the U.S. intervention we discussed, Vance's comments, Musk's support, that definitely became a hot-button issue in those final days of campaigning, didn't it?
Oh, for sure. It was widely reported and debated in the German media.
Yeah.
Big topic.
But what's notable, though, maybe surprising to some, is that the AfD's final vote share, it largely aligned with what the pre-election polls had been predicting anyway.
It's true, which suggests that while the U.S. intervention certainly, stirred the political pot and definitely impacted German-U.S. relations,
right,
it might not have fundamentally altered the actual election outcome itself. People who are going to vote AfD likely already were.
Interesting. So, okay, to try and bring all these threads together, we basically see the central tension laid bare, right? Germany views its actions classifying the AfD as suspected extremists as a necessary defense of its democracy, grounded in its constitution and those hard-won historical lessons.
While on the other hand, significant, powerful voices in the U.S. see the very same actions as suppressing a popular opposition party as anti-democratic itself.
And this fundamental disagreement, this clash of perspectives, carries some potentially significant long-term consequences, not just for the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Germany.
But potentially for the broader Transatlantic alliance as a whole. It exposes fault lines.
Definitely. So here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. Looking at all these different, sometimes conflicting definitions of extremism and really weighing that heavy historical context for Germany, what does this whole incident tell us about the inherent challenges? The challenges of defining and responding to perceived threats to democratic values in different societies with different histories.
And perhaps, what role, if any, should external actors, other countries, influential figures, play in such complex and incredibly sensitive domestic situations? Where's the line between expressing concern and unwarranted interference?
Lots to think about there.